Unlike the battleships the enemy had caught moored on Battleship Row, Pennsylvania (BB-38), the fleet flagship, lay on keel blocks, sharing Dry Dock No. 1 at the Navy Yard with Casson (DD-372) and Downs (DD-375), two destroyers side by side ahead of her. Three of Pennsylvania's four propeller shafts had been removed, and she was receiving all steam, power, and water from the yard. Although her being in dry dock had excused her from taking part in anti-aircraft drills, her crew swiftly manned her machine guns after the first bombs exploded among the PBY flying boats parked on the south end of Ford Island. "Air defense stations," then sounded, followed by general quarters. Men knocked the locks off ready-use ammunition stowage, and Pennsylvania opened fire about 8:02. The fleet flagship and the two destroyers nestled in the dry dock ahead of her led a charmed life until dive bombers from Soryu and Hiru targeted the dry dock area between 8:30 and 9:15. One bomb penetrated Pennsylvania's boat deck, just to the rear of 5-inch 25-gun No. 7, and detonated in casemate No. 9. Of Pennsylvania's Marine Detachment, 2 men, Privates Patrick P. Tobin and George H. Wade, Jr., died outright, 13 fell wounded, and 6 were listed as missing. 3 of the wounded, Corporal Morris E. Nations and Jesse C. Vincent, Jr., and Private First Class Floyd D. Stewart, died later the same day. As the onslaught descended upon the battleships and the air station, Marine detachments hurried to their battle stations on board other ships elsewhere at Pearl. In the Navy Yard lay Argonne, AG-31, the flagship of the base force. The heavy cruisers New Orleans, CA-32, and San Francisco, CA-38, and the light cruisers Honolulu, CL-48, St. Louis, CL-49, and Helena, CL-50. To the northeast of Ford Island lay the light cruiser Phoenix, CL-43. Although Utah was torpedoed and sunk at her berth early in the attack, her 14 Marines, on temporary duty at the 14th Naval District Rifle Range, found useful employment combating the enemy. The Fleet Machine Gun School lay on Oahu's south coast, west of the Pearl Harbor entrance channel at Fort Weaver. The men stationed there, including several Marines on temporary duty from the carrier Enterprise and the battleships California and Pennsylvania, sprang to action at the first sounds of war. Working with the men from the rifle range, all hands set up and mounted guns, and broke out and belted ammunition between 7:55 and 8:10. All those present at the range were issued pistols or rifles from the facility's armory. Soon after the raid began, Platoon Sergeant Harold G. Edwards set about securing the camp against any incursion the Japanese might attempt from the landward side, and also supervised the emplacement of machine guns along the beach. Lieutenant J. G. Roy R. Nelson, the officer in charge of the rifle range, remembered the many occasions when Captain Frank M. Reinecke, commanding officer of Utah's Marine Detachment and the senior instructor at the Fleet Machine Gun School, and, as his Naval Academy classmates remembered, quite a conversationalist, had maintained that the school's weapons would be a great asset if anybody ever attacked Hawaii. By 8:10 Reinecke's gunners stood ready to prove the point and soon engaged the enemy, most likely torpedo planes clearing Pearl Harbor or high-level bombers approaching from the south. Nearby Army units, perhaps alerted by the Marines' fire, opened up soon thereafter. Unfortunately, the eager gunners succeeded in downing one of 2 SBTs from Enterprise that were attempting to reach Hickam Field. An Army crash boat, fortunately, rescued the pilot and his wounded passengers soon thereafter. On board Argonne, meanwhile, alongside 1010 Dock, her Marines manned her starboard 3-inch 23 battery and her machine guns. Commander Fred W. Connor, the ship's commanding officer, later credited Corporal Alfred Schlag with shooting down one Japanese plane as it headed for Battleship Row. When the attack began, Helena lay moored alongside 1010 Dock, the venerable mine layer Oglala, CM3, outboard. A signalman standing watch on the light cruiser's signal bridge at 7:57 identified the planes over Ford Island as Japanese, and the ship went to general quarters. Before she could fire a shot in her own defense, however, one 800-kilogram torpedo barreled into her starboard side about a minute after the general alarm had begun summoning her men to their battle stations. The explosion vented up from the forward engine room through the hatch and passageways, catching many of the crew running to their stations, and started fires on the third deck. Platoon Sergeant Robert W. Teague, Privates First Class Paul F. Hubner, Jr., and George E. Johnson, and Private Lester A. Morris were all severely burned. Johnson later died. To the southeast, New Orleans lay across the pier from her sister ship, San Francisco. The former went to general quarters soon after enemy planes had been sighted dive-bombing Ford Island around 7:57. At 8:05, as several low-flying torpedo planes roared by, bound for Battleship Row, Marine sentries on the fantail opened fire with rifles and .45s. New Orleans men, meanwhile, so swiftly manned the 1.1-inch 75 quads and the 50-caliber machine guns under the direction of Captain William R. Collins, the commanding officer of the ship's Marine detachment, that the ship actually managed to shoot at torpedo planes passing her stern. San Francisco, however, under major overhaul, with neither operative armament nor major caliber ammunition on board, was thus restricted to having her men fire small arms at whatever Japanese planes came within range. Some of her crew, though, hurried over to New Orleans, which was near missed by one bomb, and helped man her 5-inchers. St. Louis, outboard of Honolulu, went to general quarters at 7:57 and opened fire with her 1.1 quadruple-mounted anti-aircraft and 50-caliber machine gun batteries, and after getting her 5-inch mounts in commission by 8:30, although without power and train, she hauled in her lines at 8:47 and got under way at 9:31. With all 5-inchers in full commission by 9:47, she proceeded to sea, passing the channel entrance buoys abeam around 10 o'clock. Honolulu, damaged by a near miss from a bomb, remained moored at her berth throughout the action. Phoenix, moored by herself in berth C6 in Pearl Harbor, to the northeast of Ford Island, noted the attacking planes at 7:55 and went to general quarters. Her machine gun battery opened fire at 8:10 on the attacking planes as they came within range. Her anti-aircraft battery 5 minutes later. Ultimately, after 2 false starts, where she had gotten under way and left her berth only to see sortie signals canceled each time, Phoenix cleared the harbor later that day and put to sea. For at least one Marine, though, the day's adventure was not over when the Japanese planes departed. Search flights took off from Ford Island, pilots taking up utility aircraft with scratch crews to look for the enemy carriers which had launched the raid. Mustered at the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, Oklahoma's Sergeant Haley, still clad in his oil-soaked underwear, volunteered to go up in a plane that was leaving on a search mission at around 11:30. He remained aloft in the plane, armed with a rifle, for some 5 hours. After the attacking planes had retired, the grim business of cleaning up and getting on with the war had to be undertaken. Muster had to be taken to determine who was missing, who was wounded, who lay dead. Men sought out their friends and shipmates. First Lieutenant Cornelius C. Smith, Jr., from the Marine Barracks at the Navy Yard, searched in vain among the maimed and dying at the Naval Hospital later that day for his friend, Harry Gaver, from Oklahoma. Death respected no rank. The most senior Marine to die that day was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel R. Fox, the decorated World War I hero and the Division Marine officer on the staff of the commander, Battleship Division I, Rear Admiral Isaac C. Kidd, who, along with Lieutenant Colonel Fox, had been killed in Arizona. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor struck some families with more force than others. Numbered among Arizona's lost were Private Gordon E. Shive of the Battleships Marine Detachment and his brother, Radioman Third Class Malcolm H. Shive, a member of the ship's company. Over the next few days, Marines from the sunken ships received reassignment to other vessels. Nevada's Marines deployed ashore to set up defensive positions in the fields adjacent to the grounded and listing warship, and the dead, those who could be found, were interred with appropriate ceremony. Eventually, the deeds of Marines in the battleship detachments were recognized by appropriate commendations and advancements in ratings. Chief among them, Gunnery Sergeant Douglas, Sergeant Haley, and Corporals Driscoll and Darling were each awarded the Navy Cross. For his meritorious conduct at the peril of his own life, Major Shapley was commended and awarded the Silver Star. Lieutenant Simonson was awarded a posthumous Bronze Star, while Tennessee's commanding officer commended Captain White for the way in which he had directed that battleship's anti-aircraft guns that morning. Titanic salvage efforts raised some of the sunken battleships, California, West Virginia, and Nevada, and they, like the surviving Marines, went on to play a part in the ultimate defeat of the enemy who had begun the war with such swift and terrible suddenness. They caught us flat-footed. At 7:40, when Fuchida's flyers had closed to within a few miles of Kahuku Point, the 43-0 split away from the rest of the formation, swinging out north and west of Wheeler Field, the headquarters of the Hawaiian Air Force, 18th Pursuit Wing. Passing further to the south, at about 7:45, the Soryu and Hiru divisions executed a hard diving turn to port and headed north toward Wheeler. 11 Zeros from Shokaku and Zuikaku simultaneously left the formation and flew east, crossing over Oahu north of Pearl Harbor to attack NAS Kaneohe Bay. 18 from Akagi and Kaga headed toward what the Japanese called Babasu Point to Hikojo, Barber's Point Aerodrome, Iwa Mooring Mast Field. Sweeping over the Waianae Range, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led Akagi's 9 Zeros, while Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga headed another division of 9 from Kaga. After the initial attack, Itaya and Shiga were to be followed by divisions from Soryu, under Lieutenant Masiji Suganami, and Hiru, under Lieutenant Kiyokumo Okajima, which were at that moment involved in attacking Wheeler to the north. In the officers' mess at Iwa, the officer of the day, Captain Leonard W. Ashwell of VMJ 252, noticed 2 formations of aircraft at 7:55. The first looked like 18 torpedo planes flying at 1,000 feet toward Pearl Harbor from Barber's Point, but the second, to the northwest, comprised about 21 planes just coming over the hills from the direction of Nanakuli, also at an altitude of about 1,000 feet. Ashwell, intrigued by the sight, stepped outside for a better look. The second formation of single-seat fighters, the 2 divisions from Akagi and Kaga, flew just to the north of Iwa and wheeled to the right. Then, flying in a string formation, they commenced firing. Recognizing the planes as Japanese, Ashwell burst back into the mess, shouting, "Air raid! Air raid! Pass the word!" He then sprinted for the guardhouse to have call to arms sounded. That Sunday morning, Technical Sergeant Henry H. Anglin, the non-commissioned officer in charge of the photographic section at Iwa, had driven from his Pearl City home with his 3-year-old son Hank to take the boy's picture at the station. The senior Anglin had just positioned the lad in front of the camera and was about to take the photo. The picture was to be a gift to the boy's grandparents, when they heard the mingled noise of airplanes and machine guns. Roaring down to within 25 feet of the ground, Itaya's group most likely carried out only 1 pass at their targets before moving on to Hickam, the headquarters of the Hawaiian Air Force's 18th Bombardment Wing. Thinking that Army pilots were showing off, Sergeant Anglin stepped outside the photographic section tent and, along with some other enlisted men, watched planes bearing Japanese markings strafing the edge of the field. Then the planes began roaring down toward the field itself, and the bullets from their cowl and wing-mounted guns began kicking up puffs of dirt. "Look, live ammunition," someone said, or thought. "Somebody'll go to prison for this." Shiga pilots, like Itaya's, concentrated on the tactical aircraft lined up neatly on Iwa's northwest apron, with short bursts of 7.7 and 20 mm machine gun fire. Shiga's pilots, unlike Itaya's, however, reversed course over the treetops and repeated their blistering attacks from the opposite direction. Within minutes, most of MiG-21's planes sat ablaze and exploding, black smoke corkscrewing into the sky. The enemy spared none of the planes. The gray SPD-1s and 2s of VMSB 232 and the 7 spare SB-2U-3s left behind by VMSB 231 when they embarked in Lexington just 2 days before. VMF 211's remaining F4F3s, left behind when the squadron deployed to Wake well over a week before, likewise began exploding in flame and smoke. At his home on Iwa Beach, 3 miles southeast of the air station, Captain Richard C. Mangrum, VMSB 232's flight officer, sat reading the Sunday comics. Often residents of that area had heard gunnery exercises, but on a Sunday morning? The chatter of gunfire and the dull thump of explosions, however, drew Mangrum's attention away from the cartoons. As he looked out his front door, planes with red ball markings on the wings and fuselage roared by at very low altitude, bound for Pearl Harbor. Up the valley in the direction of Wheeler Field, smoke was boiling skyward, as it was from Iwa. As he set out for Iwa on an old country road, wives and children of Marines who lived in the Iwa Beach neighborhood began gathering at the Mangrums' house. Elsewhere in the Iwa Beach community, Mrs. Charles S. Barker, Jr., wife of Master Technical Sergeant Barker, the chief clerk in MAG-21's operations office, heard the noise and asked, "What's all the shooting?" Barker, clad only in beach shorts, looked out his front door, saw and heard a plane fly by at low altitude, and then saw splashes along the shoreline from strafing planes marked with red Hinomaru. Running out to turn off the water hose in his front yard, and seeing a small explosion nearby, probably an anti-aircraft shell from the direction of Pearl, Barker had seen enough. He left his wife and baby with his neighbors and set out for Iwa. The strafers who singled out cars moving along the roads that led to Iwa proved no respecter of persons. MAG-21's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Claude A. Sheriff Larkin, en route from Honolulu, was about a mile from Iwa in his 1930 Plymouth when a Zero shot at him. He momentarily abandoned the car for the relative sanctuary of a nearby ditch, not even bothering to turn off the engine, and then, as the strafer roared out of sight, sprinted back to the vehicle, jumped back in, and sped on. He reached his destination at 8:05, just in time to be machine-gunned again by one of Admiral Nagumo's fighters. Soon thereafter, Larkin's good fortune at remaining unwounded amidst the attack ran out, as he suffered several penetrating wounds, the most painful of which included one on the top of the middle finger of his left hand, and another on the front of his lower left leg, just above the top of his shoe. Refusing immediate medical attention, though, Larkin continued to direct the defense of Iwa Field. Pilots and ground crewmen alike rushed out onto the mat to try to save their planes from certain destruction. At least a few pilots intended to get airborne, but could not because most of their aircraft were either afire or riddled beyond any hope of immediate use. Captain Milo G. Haynes of VMF 211 sought safety behind a tractor, he and the machine's driver taking shelter on the side opposite to the strafers. Another Zero came in from another angle, however, and strafed them from that direction. Spraying bullets clipped off Haynes' necktie just beneath his chin. Then, as a momentarily relieved Haynes put his right hand at the back of his head, a bullet lacerated his right little finger and a part of his scalp. In the midst of the confusion, an excited 3-year-old Hank Anglin innocently took advantage of his father's distraction with the battle and wandered toward the mat. All of the noise seemed like a lot of fun. Sergeant Anglin ran after his son, got him to the ground, and shielding him with his own body, crawled some 35 yards, little puffs of dirt coming near them at times. As they clambered inside the radio trailer to get out of harm's way, a bullet made a hole above the door. Moving back to the photo tent, the elder Anglin put his son under a wooden bench. As he sat about gathering his camera gear to take pictures of the action, a bullet went through his left arm. Deprived of the use of that arm for a time, Anglin returned to the bench under which his son still crouched obediently, to see little Hank point to a spent bullet on the floor, and hear him warn, "Don't touch that, Daddy, it's hot." Private First Class James W. Mann, the driver assigned to Ewa's 1938 Ford ambulance, had been refueling the vehicle when the attack began. When Lieutenant Thomas L. Allman, Medical Corps U.S.N., the group medical officer, saw the first planes break into flames, he ordered Mann to take the ambulance to the flight line. Accompanied by pharmacist mate 2nd Class Orrin D. Smith, a corpsman from sick bay, they sped off. The Japanese planes seemed to be attracted to the bright red crosses on the ambulance, however, and halted its progress near the mooring mast. Realizing that they were under attack, Mann floored the brake pedal, and the Ford screeched to a halt. Rather than leave the vehicle for a safer area, Mann and Smith crawled underneath it so that they could continue their mission as quickly as possible. The strafing, however, continued unabated. Ironically, the first casualty Mann had to collect was the man lying prone beside him. Orrin Smith felt a searing pain as one of the Japanese 7.7 millimeter rounds found its mark in the fleshy part of his left calf. Seeing that the corpsman had been hurt, Mann assisted him out from under the vehicle and up into the cab. Despite continued strafing that shot out 4 tires, Mann pressed doggedly ahead and delivered the wounded Smith to sick bay. After seeing that the corpsman's bleeding was stopped and the painful wound was cleaned and dressed, Private First Class Mann sprinted to his own tent. Grabbing his rifle, he then returned to the battered ambulance and, shot out tires flopping, drove toward Ewa's garage. There, Master Technical Sergeant Lawrence R. Darner directed his men to replace the damaged tires with those from a mobile water purifier. Meanwhile, Smith resumed his duties as a member of the dressing station crew. Also watching the smoke beginning to billow skyward was Sergeant Dwayne W. Shaw, USMCR, the driver of the station fire truck. Normally, during off-duty hours, the truck sat parked a quarter-mile from the landing area. Shaw, figuring that it was his job to put out the fires, climbed into the fire engine and set off. Unfortunately, like Private First Class Mann's ambulance, Sergeant Shaw's bright red engine, moving across the embattled camp, soon attracted strafing Zeros. Unfazed by the enemy fire that perforated his vehicle in several places, he drove doggedly toward the flight line until another Zero shot out his tires. Only then, pausing to make a hasty estimate of the situation, he reasoned that with the fire truck at least temporarily out of service, he would have to do something else. Climbing down from the cab, he soon got himself a rifle and some ammunition. Then he set out for the flight line. If he could not put out fires, he could at least do some firing of his own at the men who caused them. With the parking area cloaked in black smoke, Japanese fighter pilots shifted their efforts to the planes either out for repairs in the rear areas or to the utility planes parked north of the intersection of the main runways. Inside 10 minutes' time, machine gun fire likewise transformed many of those planes into flaming wreckage. Firing only small arms and rifles in the opening stages, the Marines fought back against Kaga's fighters as best they could, with almost reckless heroism. Lieutenant Shiga remembered one particular Leatherneck who, oblivious to the machine gun fire striking the ground around him and kicking up dirt, stood transfixed, emptying his side arm at Shiga's Zero as it roared past. Years later, Shiga would describe that lone, defiant, and unknown Marine as the bravest American he had ever met. A tragic drama, however, soon unfolded amidst the Japanese attack. One Marine, Sergeant William E. Lutchen, Jr., USMCR, a truck driver, had been under suspicion of espionage, and he was ordered placed under arrest. In the exchange of gunfire that followed his resisting being taken into custody, though, he was shot dead. With that one exception, the Marines at Iwo Field had fought back to a man. As if Akagi's and Kaga's fighters had not sown enough destruction on Iwo, one division of Zeros from Soryu and one from Hiru arrived on the scene, fresh from laying waste to many of the plains at Wheeler Field. This second group of fighter pilots went about their work with the same deadly precision exhibited at Wheeler only minutes before. The raid caught Master Technical Sergeant Darner's crew in the middle of changing the tires on the station's ambulance. Private First Class Mann, who by that point had managed to obtain some ammunition for his rifle, dropped down with the rest of the Marines at the garage and fired at the attacking fighters as they streaked by. Lieutenant Kiyokumo Okajima led his 6 fighters down through the rolling smoke, executing strafing attacks until ground fire holed the forward fuel tank of his wingman, Petty Officer First Class Kazuo Muranaka. When Okajima discovered the damage to Muranaka's plane, he decided that his men had pressed their luck far enough, and began to assemble his unit and shepherd them toward the rendezvous area some 10 miles west of Cana Point. The retiring Japanese, in all likelihood, then spotted incoming planes from Enterprise CV-6 that had been launched at 6:18 to scout 150 miles ahead of the ship in 9 two-plane sections. Their planned flight path to Pearl was to take many of them over Iwo Mooring Mast Field, where some would encounter Japanese aircraft. Meanwhile, back at Iwo, after what must have seemed an eternity, the Zeros of the first wave at last wheeled away toward their rendezvous point. Having made a shambles of the Marine air base, Japanese pilots claimed the destruction of 60 aircraft on the ground. Akagi's airmen accounted for 11, Kaga's 15, Soryu's 12, and Hiryu's 22. Their figures were not too far off the mark, for 47 aircraft of all types had been parked at the field at the beginning of the onslaught, 33 of which had been fully operational. Although the Japanese had wreaked havoc upon MiG-21's complement of planes, the group's casualties seemed miraculously light. Apparently, the enemy fighter pilots in the first wave maintained a fairly high degree of discipline, eschewing attacks on people and concentrating their attacks on machines. Many of Iwo's Marines, however, had parked their cars near the center of the station. By the time the Japanese departed, the parking lot resembled a junkyard of mangled automobiles of various makes and models. Overcoming the initial shock of the first strafing attack, Iwo's Marines took stock of their situation. As soon as the last of Itaya's and Shiga's Zeros had departed, Marines went out and manned stations with rifles and .30 caliber machine guns taken from damaged aircraft and from the squadron ordnance rooms. Technical Sergeant William G. Turnage, an armorer, supervised the setting up of the free machine guns. Technical Sergeant Anglin, meanwhile, took his little boy to the guardhouse, where a woman motorist agreed to drive Hank home to his mother. As it would turn out, that reunion was not to be accomplished until much later that day, inasmuch as the distraught mother had already left home to look for her son. Master Technical Sergeant Emil S. Peters, a veteran of action in Nicaragua, had, during the first attack, reported to the Central Ordnance Tent to lend a hand in manning a gun. By the time he arrived there, however, there were none left to man. Then he saw a Douglas SPD-2, one of the two spares assigned to VMSB 232, parked behind the squadron's tents. Enlisting the aid of Private William G. Turner, VMSB 231 squadron clerk, Peters ran over to the ex-Lexington machine that still bore her USN markings 2B6, pulled the after canopy forward, and clambered in the after cockpit, stepping hard on the foot pedal to unship the free .30 caliber Browning from its housing in the after fuselage, and then locking it in place. Turner, having obtained a supply of belted ammunition, took his place on the wing as Peters' assistant. Elsewhere, nursing his painfully wounded finger and leg, Lieutenant Colonel Larkin ordered extra guards posted on the perimeter of the field and on the various roads leading into the base. Men not engaged in active defense went to work fighting the many fires. Drivers parked what trucks and automobiles had remained intact on the runways to prevent any possible landings by airborne troops. Although hardly transforming Iwa into a fortress, the Marines ensured that they would be ready for any future attack. Undoubtedly, most of the men at Iwa expected, correctly, that the Japanese would return. At about 8:35, enemy planes again made their appearance in the sky over Iwa, but this time Marines stood or crouched ready and waiting for what proved to be Lieutenant Commander Takahashi's dive-bombing unit from Shokaku, returning from its attack on the Naval Air Station at Pearl Harbor and the Army's Hickam Field, roaring in from just above the treetops. Initially, their targets appeared to be the planes, but seeing that most had already been destroyed, the enemy pilots turned to strafing buildings and people in a heavy and prolonged assault. Better prepared than they had been when Lieutenant Commander Italia Zeros had opened the battle, Iwa's Marines met Takahashi's Vals with heavy fire from rifles, Thompson machine guns, .30 caliber machine guns, and even pistols. In retaliation, after completing their strafing runs, the Japanese pilots pulled up in steep wingovers, allowing their rear seat gunners to take advantage of the favorable deflection angle to spray the defenders with 7.7 millimeter bullets. Marine observers later recounted that Shokaku's planes also dropped light bombs, perhaps of the 60-kilogram variety, as they counted 5 small craters on the field after the attack. In response to the second onslaught, as they had in the first, all available Marines threw themselves into the desperate defense of their base. The additional strafing attack started numerous fires within the camp area, adding new columns of dense smoke to those still rising from the planes on the parking apron. Unfortunately, the ground fire seemed far more brave than accurate, because all of Shokaku's dive bombers repeatedly zoomed skyward, seemingly unhurt. Even taking into account possible damage sustained during attacks over Ford Island and Hickam, only 4 of Takahashi's planes sustained any damage over Oahu before they retired. The departure of Shokaku's Vals afforded Lieutenant Colonel Larkin the opportunity to reorganize the camp defenses. There was ammunition to be distributed, wounded men to be succored, and seemingly innumerable fires burning amidst the tents, buildings, and planes to be extinguished. However, around 9:30, yet another flight of enemy planes appeared, about 15 Vals from Kaga and Hiryu. Although the pilots of those planes had expended their 250-kilogram bombs on ships at Pearl Harbor, they still apparently retained plenty of 7.7 millimeter ammunition, and seemed determined to expend much of what remained upon Iwa. As in the previous attacks by Shokaku's Vals, the last group came in at very low altitude from just over the tops of the trees surrounding the station. Quite taken by the high maneuverability of the nimble dive bombers, which they were seeing at close hand for the second time that day, the Marines mistook them for fighter aircraft with fixed landing gear. Around that time, Lieutenant Colonel Larkin saw an American plane and a Japanese one collide in midair, a short distance away from the field. In all probability, Larkin saw Enterprise's Ensign John H. L. Vaugh's Dauntless collide with a Val. Vaught had become separated from his section leader during the pearl-bound flight in from the carrier, may have circled offshore, and then arrived over Ewa in time to encounter dive bombers from Kaga or Hiryu. Vaught and his passenger, radioman 3rd Class Sidney Pierce, bailed out of their SBD, but at too low an altitude, for both died in the trees when their chutes failed to deploy fully. Neither of the Japanese crewmen escaped from their Val when it crashed. Fortunately for the Marines, however, the last raid proved comparatively light and ineffectual, something Lieutenant Colonel Larkin attributed to the heavy gunfire thrown skyward. The short respite between the second and third strafing attacks had allowed Ewa's defenders to bring all possible weapons to bear against the Japanese. Technical Sergeant Turnage, after having gotten the base's machine guns set up and ready for action, took over one of the mounts himself and fired several bursts into the belly of one Val that began trailing smoke and began to falter soon thereafter. Turnage, however, was by no means the only Marine using his weapon to good effect. Master Technical Sergeant Peters and Private Turner, from their improvised position in the lamed SBD, had let fly at whatever Vals came within range of their guns. The two Marines shot down what witnesses thought were at least two of the attacking planes, and discouraged strafing in that area of the station. However, the Japanese soon tired of the tenacious bravery of the grizzled veteran and the young clerk, neither of whom flinched in the face of repeated strafing. Two particular enemy pilots repeatedly peppered the grounded Dauntless with 7.7 millimeter fire, ultimately scoring hits near the cockpit area and wounding both men. Turner toppled from the wing, mortally wounded. Another Marine who distinguished himself during the third strafing attack was Sergeant Carlo A. Micheletto of Marine Utility Squadron, VMJ 252. During the first Japanese attack that morning, Micheletto proceeded at once to VMJ 252's parking area and went to work, helping in the attempts to extinguish the fires that had broken out amongst the squadron's parked utility planes. He continued in those labors until the last strafing attack began. Putting aside his firefighting equipment and grabbing a rifle, he took cover behind a small pile of lumber and, heedless of the heavy machine gunning, continued to fire at the attacking planes until a burst of enemy fire struck him in the head and killed him instantly. End of Part 2.